I have a take on what happened between Alex Pretti and the Border Patrol officers. And I have drawn conclusions. But unlike officials in the Trump administration, I drew my conclusions after seeing multiple videos and hearing multiple witnesses. So Greg Bavino, Kristi Noem, and Stephen Miller, the president himself, have made a big deal about the fact that Alex Pretti was carrying a concealed firearm, a loaded concealed firearm, to the protest in Minneapolis. Now, as you all know, he had a permit to legally carry that gun, and that is something that the National Rifle Association said, why is anybody in the administration questioning that? There is a Second Amendment right to lawfully carry a gun, and that's what he did. What no one is talking about, and I think this is the essence of this whole matter, is when the police knew that he was carrying a gun. Now, if they knew early on, before the fatal altercation, that he was carrying this firearm, then they would have every right to really put eyes on him, maybe even to confront him. And it wouldn't have surprised me if they knew that they would have taken the gun away from him, because that poses a potential threat. If they knew that, if he had brandished it, which he didn't, despite what Kristi Noem said. He didn't touch it, he didn't brandish it, and the video shows that. And the officers, and this is the key, the officers had no idea that he had a gun. They were operating in the dark. So as far as they knew, what they were dealing with was a guy who was a big annoyance to them. 5 minutes before the altercation, there is Pretti in the middle of the street. The officers confront him. They move him to the sidewalk. He puts his hands up, and it's clear they want him on the sidewalk. And then they go about their business, and they are taking down a guy in the middle of the street. Guess what? There is Pretti again, standing in the street, filming the officer subduing the man on the ground. And the officers, I think, are annoyed at the very least, and probably pissed that there is this guy, who, by the way, is very tall and stands out, filming them after they told him to stand on the sidewalk. So the two women who were ultimately violently thrown to the ground by the officers, they were there in the middle of the street blowing whistles, which basically is a warning to everybody that Border Patrol and ICE are in the area. So how do I conclude that these officers were just pissed off at this guy, a guy they had no idea he had a gun, but they were pissed off at him because he defied them by going back in the street. He was filming them, which they clearly don't like. And these women were telling everybody, Border Patrol and ICE are here. So how do I know that the officers are pissed? Watch the video. Watch their reaction to these two women. They violently throw them to the ground. Why? Why that kind of fervor? They were not happy with these women. And when Pretti dares to go over and help them, again, with the officers having no idea he has a gun, look at what they do. They pepper spray him. They take him to the ground. At least five officers are on top of him. They hit him in the head with a pepper spray canister. They punch him. Does that feel like anger? Somebody who walked over to help these two women, and that was their reaction. To me, that's the reaction, not to Pretti helping the two women, but to Pretti defying them by going back in the street after he was told not to and continuing to film them. They were pissed off at him. They were pissed off at him. So, when one of the officers notices that Pretti has a gun, as they swarm him on the ground, because probably his shirt came up and they saw the concealed weapon, you hear an officer scream, "Gun, gun, gun." That tells you a couple of things. Number one, they obviously saw the gun, but it also tells you this is the first time they knew he had a gun. They did not know until that moment that he had a gun, because they wouldn't have been that alarmed when they saw it to scream, "Gun, gun, gun." And then one of the officers pretty clearly takes the gun out of the waist area, and you see him hold it behind him. The officer who fires the first shot is looking down so he can see Pretti. He can see that Pretti does not have a gun. And indeed, a second before, the gun was fully away from his body. So why did he shoot? So you've got pissed off officers there in a chaotic scene where they are basically unloading a can of whoop ass on this guy, and somebody is screaming, "Gun, gun, gun," and this is what happened. So this was not about Alex Pretti taking a gun to the scene. They didn't know until the last second, literally the last second, that he had a gun. This was about officers who were pissed off that they were defied by Alex Pretti, who was protesting their presence in Minneapolis. So all of this talk, this bluster from Kristi Noem calling, saying that he was brandishing a weapon, and Greg Bovino saying that he was there to massacre officers, and Stephen Miller calling him an assassin and a domestic terrorist. It's all BS, and everybody knows it. I mean, you can't look at what you see fairly and say they're right, because they're not right, and it's obvious, and they know they're not right. They know they literally and figuratively jumped the gun. They know that that story, the public is not buying what they're selling. They know it. And it just goes to show that they are incapable of just saying, "We made a mistake." And it's clear that they made a mistake by jumping to those conclusions. And now that you see all these videos, hear from all these witnesses, it's pretty clear who you're going to believe, me or your lying eyes. That's what they would be saying to you. And you should be believing what your eyes are showing you and what you're hearing. And I want to end with this. After George Floyd was murdered, people came together. And it didn't matter whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. When you saw what you saw, it was clear what happened. And there were plenty of Republicans who condemned what happened to George Floyd. And Democrats and Republicans are not going to agree all the time. They're not going to agree much at all. But at a point, you got to agree on some things. And this is so apparent that what happened here was wrong. And what these officials in the administration are saying is just false. And everybody knows it's false. And even if you acknowledge it, it doesn't mean that you still can't hold on to your views. You can. But when you don't acknowledge what is right in front of you, you just lose credibility for the things that matter to you down the line.